All right, well, let's go to Revelation chapter 12. And we will be finishing up the chapter tonight. Revelation chapter 12, we'll be starting in verse number 10. And like I said, finishing up the chapter. So verse number 10, it says, "And I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, Now is come salvation and strength, and the kingdom of our God, and the power of his Christ. For the accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accused them before our God day and night. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto the death. Therefore rejoice, ye heavens, and ye that dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come down unto you, having great wrath, because he knoweth that he hath but a short time. And when the dragon saw that he was cast into the earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the face of the serpent. And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth, and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. And the dragon was wroth with the woman, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which kept the commandments of God, and have the testimony of Jesus Christ." All right, so in verse number 10, we see that there is this loud voice that is crying out, ringing out in heaven. And as far as the identity of this voice, we're not told. It is perhaps one of the 24 elders. Perhaps it is one of the other redeemed saints that are there at that time. It is likely not an angel because of the language that is used. He says that for the accuser of our brethren. The accuser of our brethren. That doesn't seem to be the language of an angel who could not really rightfully say our brethren. So it would seem to be perhaps one of these other camps, but whatever the reason, those in heaven are beginning to shout out in praise, because what's happening is they are beginning to see the end. They're beginning to sense that this thing is coming to an end, and they're beginning to rejoice. It says, "Now is come salvation and strength, and the kingdom of our God, and the power of his Christ." Now the fact that Satan's access to heaven is cut off is a sign to the heavenly hosts that the victory of Christ and the establishment of his kingdom, and I think that that's a reference really both to the millennial and to the eternal kingdom, but that the establishment of his kingdom is near. And so they're crying out, and they're crying out in praise and worship, because they've been through a lot, and they're seeing this come to an end, and they can sense the second coming of Christ, the return, when he comes and he fights this battle, and he enters into the millennial kingdom, and all of these wonderful and grand and marvelous things. And so they're beginning to see, we're getting very, very close. And so the reason for their praise, the specific reason for their praise here, is that the accuser of our brethren is cast down. And it says this, which accused them before God day and night. Now, we talked about this a few weeks ago, about the fact that that Satan still has, as we speak right now, a degree of access into heaven so that he can go and actually accuse us. And this is what he does. And I want you to turn back to Zechariah chapter 3. And we'll see kind of an example of this happening in the Old Testament. And so Zechariah chapter 3, and we'll see just what I think is a very interesting story here. Zechariah chapter 3, let's look at a few verses here. Verse number 1, it says, "And he showed me Joshua the high priest, standing before the angel of the Lord," and look what it says here, "and Satan standing at his right hand to resist him." And verse 2, "And the Lord said unto Satan, The Lord rebuke thee, O Satan, even the Lord that hath chosen Jerusalem rebuke thee. Is not this a brand plucked out of the fire?" And look at verse 3, it says, "Now Joshua was clothed with filthy garments, and stood before the angel. And he answered and spake unto those that stood before him, saying, Take away the filthy garments from him. And unto him he said, Behold, I have caused thine iniquity to pass from thee, and I will clothe thee with change of raiment." And so a wonderful event taking place here that we get to get a little bit of a glimpse of. But I think that what we see here is an example of how this accusation might take place. And so here we see Joshua as the accused, and I will say this, in this particular text here, Zechariah chapter 3, Joshua is actually standing, and it says there, as the high priest. And so Joshua is not standing there as an individual, but as a representative of the nation of Israel. But the reason I come here is because I think it gives us an idea of how this happens. And so we see Joshua as the accused, and we see Satan as the accuser. But on the other side, we see God the Father as the judge, and we see God the Son as the advocate. And of course, we understand that that's how things continue on today. And so we can see in this example how Satan can come and look at this. He can rightfully point out the sinfulness of the one being accused. And so he comes and he's resisting there, Joshua. But look at verse 3. It says, Joshua was clothed with filthy garments, and he stood before the angel. And so Satan could rightfully come and say, look at how dreadful this man is. Look at how terrible this man is. Look at the nasty garments that he is wrapped in. And so he's not coming with accusations that are in of themselves false, because when he comes to accuse us, we are sinful. These things happen. And so he can come and he can rightfully point out and say, look at the sinfulness of this person. But then look what happens, verse number 4. It says, and he answered, and he being the angel of the Lord there, and he answered and spake unto those that stood before him, saying, take away the filthy garments from him. And unto him he said, behold, I have caused thine iniquity to pass from thee. And look what he does, and I will clothe thee with change of raiment. I will clothe thee with change of raiment. And so Joshua was standing in defiled garments. That was the truth. Yet the angel of the Lord forgave his sins and gave him a change of clothes. Now for us today, of course, the forgiveness of sins has already taken place. For those who are saved, the forgiveness of sins has happened, and so we stand before him already clothed in the righteousness of Jesus Christ. But Satan can come before God as the accuser and say, well, look at them, look at what they're done. And Jesus, as our advocate, can stand by the Father and say, no, listen, I've paid for those sins. Those sins have been covered. And so Satan still, to this day, he's still going, he's still trying to accuse the brethren, he's still trying to do all this. But again, we have an advocate with Jesus who stands and makes intercession for us. And so we have the greatest advocate in the world. And so this is what he does. He stands as the accuser. And so the hosts of heaven here are thrilled, I think, for a number of reasons. As we talked about, that they can kind of sense the end is coming. But they're thrilled that this is no longer going to take place. His access is gone. He's not coming up and doing this anymore. And so they're thrilled from the standpoint of they don't have to take place in this anymore. And then look at verse number 11. It says, and they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto the death. Now the they there in verse 11 is referring to those who had been accused prior to Satan's casting from heaven. And so they overcame him prior to his casting out from heaven, when he was still doing the accusing. And so prior to his being casting out from heaven, it says in Romans chapter 8, it says, who shall lay anything to the charge of God's elect? It is God that justifieth. Just like Joshua in the example we just saw, the accusations of Satan fall on deaf ears, for our sins are covered in the blood of Christ. Our defiled garments have been changed for the righteous garments of Jesus. And then it says there, not only do they overcome by the blood of the Lamb, but they overcome by the word of their testimony. That simply speaks to their obedience to the word of Christ. Obedience even in a time where they're being persecuted for that obedience, unlike what we understand now as far as persecution is concerned. And then the last phrase there in verse 11, and they loved not their lives unto the death. I'm going to quote Thomas Constable here. I don't know if you can see that very well, but he said, because of the proleptic nature of this song, the singers were probably referring to believers who would yet suffer martyrdom during the last half of the tribulation. The word of God to which they bear testimony is another key to their success, along with the Lamb's blood. They would consent to die rather than prove unfaithful to Christ. And we know that this is going to take place, and we'll see this more as we get into chapter 13. But we know that martyrdom is going to be rampant during the tribulation, as people are going to refuse to take the mark, to refuse to bow down to the image of the beast, to refuse to worship the beast. And again, we'll see that once we get over into chapter 13. Now finally, heaven can rejoice, as we said, because the accuser is gone. He's gone to earth. He's never coming back to heaven again. However, those on earth are going to pay the price. His anger over his defeat at the hands of Michael, plus his knowledge of his limited time, are what helped make the last 3.5 years of the tribulation a time that Jesus himself says, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And again, I don't want to belabor this point. We've talked about this already, but you add on top of all the things that we've already talked about, all the things that we've already studied up to this particular text, now add in the fury of Satan as he's been kicked out of heaven, cannot come back, knows his time is limited, still is trying to come against God, still wants to attack, as we're going to see here in just a second. He wants to do all these things. He's going to do them, and he knows he has a short time. And so all of the terribleness that we've already studied, you just add that on top of everything, and you can understand that we can't really grasp just how awful and terrible and, for lack of a better phrase, how hellish this particular time is going to be, because that's what it's going to be. All right, well, let's go on here. Let's look at verse number 13. And when the dragon saw that he was cast unto the earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child. Now, we're kind of jumping back to verse number 6, okay? So verse number 6 says, And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. And then verse 13, the dragon is now, he's coming after this woman to persecute the woman which brought forth the man-child. Now we discussed when we started chapter 12, the woman is Israel, the man-child is Jesus, and so Satan is attacking Israelites, or the Jewish people, during this last 3.5 years in particular. I think he will broaden that attack to anybody who claims the name of Christ, but in particular, he's coming after the Jewish people. And so Walvoord, said Israel, John Walvoord, said Israel is hated by Satan, not because of any of its own characteristics, but because she is the chosen of God and essential to the overall purpose of God for time and eternity. One of the reasons why, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but one of the reasons why I believe what I believe about the end times, one of the reasons why I hold to the particular eschatology that I have, is because I believe that Israel still has a purpose. I believe that God is not done with Israel yet. In other words, I don't believe that the church has come in and basically swooped in and stolen all the promises that were given to Israel in the Old Testament. I do not believe that. I believe that when God made an unconditional covenant with Israel, he's going to keep that unconditional covenant with Israel, and I don't believe it's been spiritualized for the church today. And so why I say that is this. There's still things that have yet to take place with regards to some of the covenants and some of the promises that God made to Israel. Some of those things are going to be taking place in the millennium. And so what does that matter? That matters because Israel must exist for Israel to receive the promise. And Israel is going to be the major player, not just one of them, the major player in the tribulation. And so God is going to save a remnant of Israel to bestow upon them the promises that he gave them in the Old Testament, at least the ones that have not yet come to fruition. And so this is why Satan hates Israel, because he knows if I can take out Israel, then God's promises are null and void. If God has no object to bestow upon that which he promised, then his promises don't mean anything. And so he wants to come at Israel because he understands how important they are, again, for the purposes of God. However, God will protect and he will guide this woman, or he will guide Israel to a place, as it says here, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time, or in other words, the same 3.5 year time period that we see at the end of verse number 6. And so again, this is referring to the second half, the latter half of the tribulation period. Now the text says that they will be taken, as it says, by 2 wings of a great eagle. Look at there, verse 14. And the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle that she might fly into the wilderness. Now we discussed this a couple weeks ago. We don't know exactly where this particular place is going to be. A lot of people suggest that it could possibly be Petra, and I'll say that I think that there's a lot of reasons why that makes sense. But we just don't know for sure. But it says here that the woman, that they're given 2 wings of a great eagle. Now, this is a reference to the Exodus, okay? Because in Exodus chapter 19, verse number 4, here's what it says. You have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings and brought you unto myself. And so this is basically going to be like a second Exodus, if you will, where God is taking the Israelite people out and taking them to a place of protection where they will be for 3.5 years. Now, this speaks not only to divine guidance, but also to divine protection, as we see in Psalm chapter 91. He shall cover thee with his feathers, and under his wings shalt thou trust. His truth shall be thy shield and buckler. But it's, to be covered by the wings is a symbol of protection. And so I think that this is referring to, again, a guide to take them where they're supposed to go. It's a reference to the nourishment with which they will be nourished for the last 3.5 years. We talked about this a few weeks ago, possibly even being fed upon the very same manna that the Israelites were fed with back in Exodus. But it also, I think, speaks of protection as well for them. Again, there must be a remnant of Israel saved through the tribulation. And so, at least to a degree, some of them will be protected. They cannot all be killed. Now, we get to see a little bit of an example of this protection that's going to take place. Now, this is kind of a little bit of an obscure reference here. We don't get a lot of details, but it is an example of the protection that's going to take place, okay? So, verse number 15, she's taken to this place, she's nourished, she's protected. Verse 15, the serpent cast out of his mouth water as of a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. Now, a couple of interesting things about this particular verse. Number one, and I think a little bit of a humorous one, at least for me, this tells us that Satan is going to know where they are. And think about how that must eat at him, that for 3.5 years, he knows where this remnant is. He hates them with a fury that I don't even think we can begin to imagine, but he can't get to them. He can't. And he's going to try. I mean, we just read it. He's going to try, but he can't. And so knowing where they are, they're still divinely protected. And as much as he might want to come against them, well, he just can't go beyond what the sovereign hand of God will allow. And so the serpent cast out his mouth water as of a flood. Now, obviously, that's symbolic language. The entirety of chapter 12 has used a plethora of symbolic terms. And so we can assume that symbolic nature has extended here into verse number 15. What I mean by that is it's not a literal serpent. We understand that's a symbol for Satan. Now, the question is, well, what about the water? Is this a literal flood? Which I wouldn't say that it necessarily can't be, but I think that probably given how chapter 12 has been so highly symbolic, that it might not reference a literal flood. It might. I'm just saying that I don't think we can be dogmatic about that given its position here surrounded by symbolic language in chapter 12. And so the woman, the child, the dragon, the stars of heaven, all of these things have been used symbolically. And again, when I say symbolically in Revelation, I mean a symbol that points to a literal reality. Okay, we're not just talking about this is just some metaphysical thing that nobody knows what it is. No, it's a symbol that points to a real, actual thing. The woman is Israel. The child is Jesus. The dragon is the devil. It's a symbol, but it points to a real thing. And so exactly what this flood is, I don't know, but I will say that it definitely points to a real event that's going to take place. This isn't talking about just like spiritual persecution. This is an actual thing that's going to happen. He's going to attack them somehow. Now, some people do actually believe that it will be a literal flood, and if that's the case, that is definitely supported by the text. It could be that. I would lend my thoughts to the fact that several people think that this is probably a reference to a great army. And I think that this is probably what this is. A great army that Satan will try to gather together and basically overwhelm the area where the Israelites are being protected, to basically flood them with an army, if you will. And so if I had to say exactly what this is, that would be my particular opinion on that. But again, we can't be dogmatic. Whatever means they use to flood them, God, the point here, God supernaturally protects them. And that's the point that's being made here. Now, John writes here in verse number 16, he says, "And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. Now, obviously, again, this could be speaking symbolically. It could. However, we do have an actual Old Testament event where this very thing happened. And so God has used this exact means before to swallow up somebody, if you will. So let me talk about this. In the Old Testament, in Numbers chapter 16, you have a few guys. You have Korah, Dathan, and Eliab. These three men, they tried to lead a rebellion against Moses and Aaron, basically saying, Moses, you have made yourself out to be our king, and nobody gave you that right. I'm staking my claim. That's essentially what's going on here. And so Korah is definitely the leader of this movement. But Moses, to make a long story short, Moses essentially presents a challenge to Korah that said, if he tells the nation, if these men, speaking of the three that I just mentioned, if these men live out their days and they die a natural death, then you can take that to mean that God is on their side. But then he got real specific. But then he said, but if the earth opens up and swallows them right here, right now, you will know that God is on my side. Now, that's a real specific challenge that Moses throws out there. But we'll see that that is exactly what happens as in Numbers chapter 16. I know that's small, but Numbers chapter 16, it says, and it came to pass as he had made an end of speaking, and so immediately after he gives this challenge, as he made an end of speaking all these words, that the ground clave asunder that was under them, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed them up, and their houses, and all the men that appertained unto Korah and to all their goods. They and all that appertained to them went down alive into the pit, and look at this, and the earth closed upon them, and they perished from among the congregation. And so what we read here in Revelation chapter 12, is this symbolic? It could be, but God's done it before, and I have every faith that he can do it again. And I have every faith that he could do it for a number of people much larger than what Korah was able to gather together to rebel against Moses. So exactly what happens here, we can't say, but the point is that God is supernaturally protecting the woman. That's the point that's being made here in verses 15 and 16. And then lastly here in verse number 17, it says, and the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war with the remnant of her seed. Now that's an interesting phrase, with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So angered at his lack of success against attacking the woman, he now moves to, and I don't think he's giving up on the woman, but now he moves to broaden his horizons, I guess you could say, to include the remnant of her seed. Now I'll tell you, there's a lot of debate regarding what that particular phrase means. Who is the remnant of her seed? There's really three kind of popular theories. Some say that this is a reference to the 144,000 Jews that were saved and sealed back in chapter 7. Some say that this is referencing all believing Jews, what we would call all Messianic Jews. Some say that this is including all believers, Jew or Gentile. And I will say that there's strong biblical cases to be made for each one of these. As far as 144,000, again, they're sealed and protected. And so we could understand that Satan could come against them, nothing would happen. All believing Jews, that would certainly fit within the realm of the remnant of her seed. And then, of course, all Jews are Gentiles. Saved Gentiles, they are spiritually the children of Abraham. And so, again, it could really be any of these. And to be honest with you, I don't really have a strong opinion towards one over the others. But whoever it is specifically, they are believers. And that's the point here again. They are believers. And we can see that it's made clearly for us. It says that he's attacking the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. And so through all of this, we see why the warning was given back in verse number 10. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come down unto you, having great wrath, because he knoweth he hath but a short time. And so chapter 12 is really setting up an understanding for us so that chapter 13 makes a little bit more sense to us. And so chapter 13, we're going to see, finally, we're going to learn a little bit about the Antichrist and the beast and the false prophet and some of the things that are going to take place, again, specifically with regards to the second half of the tribulation. But we're going to see Again, just some terrible things, but what chapters 12 and 13 and 14 are more or less generically the tribulation from the perspective of Satan, oddly. And so we've seen the tribulation from the perspective of God up to this point. Now we're seeing it kind of again from the other perspective. And so that was his fall, his future fall when his access is denied, the way that he's going to attack Israel and the remnant of her seed. And then in chapter 13, we'll get into how he has influenced the Antichrist and his relationship there and how they go forward into the tribulation, and again, specifically that second half. But we still have a lot of very interesting things to get into with regards to Revelation, and obviously all of it culminating in the glorious return of Christ that moves us on into the millennial kingdom, and then from there on to the New Jerusalem and the new heaven. So some great things continuing to come up in the book of Revelation. All right.